I'm sure I'm blowing you out. Those of you that seen me speak before know I am a visual person and am usually used to seeing my audience, so this is a new experience for me as well. Heather asked me to cover nitrogen management, present and future, and I'm going to touch a little bit on, I guess, the past, because I think we're in a transition stage here where what was the present is now the past. So I'm going to go through a couple different things. With that, see if I can figure out how to work this. We're going to cover nitrogen management basics. We're going to talk about why we need to improve nitrogen management. I mean, a lot of people would contend that we're doing just fine the way we're going. I'm going to introduce the concept of adaptive management as a process, and then talk a little bit specifically about the research that we've been doing here in Maryland and the Mid-Atlantic with active optical sensors and variable rate nitrogen. So nitrogen management basics. Since the early 90s in Maryland, in corn and wheat and all crops, farmers have had to apply nitrogen based on University of Maryland recommendations. And for corn, simply is 1 pound of nitrogen per bushel of expected yield using a realistic yield goal. And then we recommend that you split apply that's based on split application of nitrogen, 30 to 40 pounds at planting and the remaining nitrogen is side dress. And if you're using manure or another organic nitrogen source, we recommend the use of the pre-side dress nitrate test, or PSNT, to help you fine-tune what your side dress nitrogen rate will be. Wheat is very similar. It's basically a mass basis approach, and we recommend 70 to 120 pounds of nitrogen with 20 to 40 of that at planting. And Bob's going to talk about how that's changing now. And then we recommend splitting the top dress in the spring between green up and peaks 5 and 6. Split application is really the starting point. And that has to do with, let me see if I can get a pointer up here. If we look right here at the way corn crop takes up nitrogen through the season and how it grows, during this rapid growth period is when the majority of your nitrogen is taken up, where the line is the slope of that line is the steepest, so that dotted line. See the arrows jumping around a little bit on my screen. Now I've lost it. There we go. So that's the rapid growth period when corn takes up. Keep losing my arrow.
Just click it.
Right. It's disappearing every once in a while. There we go. Okay. Sorry, folks. So at the rapid growth period is when corn's taking up most of its nitrogen. That starts around V4 to V6, 40 days or so after planting. And so if we look over here, if you apply all your nitrogen up front at the beginning, it's vulnerable that entire period until the rapid growth period starts. The nitrogen that's applied is vulnerable for loss, primarily in leaching, but also surface runoff or volatilization, depending on what form and how it was applied. So if we split apply, I keep losing my arrow. If we split apply, there's not as much nitrogen at risk. Notice the white area, the nitrogen isn't at risk until you apply it right there before a rapid growth period. So that split application in corn or wheat is very important. So the nitrogen rate recommendations in Maryland for corn, wheat, for any crop were determined basically the same way. This is a slide from Iowa State, but it shows the difference between economically optimum nitrogen rate and agronomically optimum nitrogen rate. The red dots indicate the economically optimum nitrogen rate for a given soil type in Iowa. And you see for different soil types they calculate different EONRs, or economic optimum nitrogen rates. And this soil here, there was no response to nitrogen. So 0 pounds of nitrogen was the economically optimum rate, and they yielded about 175 bushels per acre, depending on soil type. The agronomically optimum nitrogen rate would be where you achieve max yield. Economically optimum nitrogen rate is just below that because it's the last increment of nitrogen that we returned or received an economic return on. So this brings us into what are some of the issues with this mass balance approach that we use and how can we improve on it. And nutrient management plans, first of all, they were meant to be a starting point. So you start with that mass balance approach using your yield goal. It's a great starting point. But you know, historical yields do not always account for climatic variability. and potential yield is not always determined by N availability. So if yield were perfectly related to nitrogen rate, all the dots in this figure would fall on the blue line, where yield and nitrogen rate are 1-to-1. So this is a variety of different soils and the economic optimum nitrogen rate for different plots. It looks like a couple hundred plots out in Iowa. They're all soy corn rotations. And they don't fall in that line. So we know that economic optimum nitrogen rate in a given year at a given location is not directly related to yield. And what's particularly interesting, again, are these sites that weren't responsive to nitrogen. Those sites that fall along that 0 on the left-hand side of the y-axis did not respond to nitrogen. So max yield was achieved with no nitrogen applied. So these sites we find very interesting when we're talking about nitrogen management. Well, what causes? Here's some of Bob Cradville's data from 2008. We're looking at 3 different sites, Beltsville, and Keedysville Research Centers. And the question is, what causes this site at the top to be unresponsive to nitrogen? We got about 200 bushels to the acre at the 0 nitrogen rate. Well, one answer could be soil organic matter. Soil organic matter is about 5% nitrogen. And soil organic nitrogen can mineralize on average about 4% per year. So if we consider a 2% organic matter soil, that's not real high. I would say it's probably reasonable in Maryland. In the surface 6 inches of the soil, which we would estimate on average has about 2 million pounds of soil per acre furrow slice, there would be 40,000 pounds of soil organic matter in that acre furrow slice. And then if we assume that it's 5% nitrogen, we take 40,000 pounds, multiply it by 0.05, and we get 2,000 pounds of nitrogen per acre furrow slice just in the organic matter. Then we use the mineralization rate of 4% per year, multiplied by 0.04, and we get 80 pounds of nitrogen mineralizing in that acre furrow slice. So an average 2% organic matter soil gives up, in an average year, 80 pounds of nitrogen in that top 6 inches. So that's a fair amount of nitrogen. That can explain some of the variation we see between yield goals and nitrogen requirement, because mineralization is dictated by weather and management, tillage. So things that occur that are temporally variable from year to year can dictate how much of that organic matter is mineralized. So I also wanted to introduce the concept of nitrogen use efficiency. There's a lot of different definitions for nitrogen use efficiency. The one I'm presenting here is the one by Ron and Johnson at Oklahoma State University in 1999 paper they published, where they said the nitrogen removed in grain minus the contribution from the soil and the atmosphere divided by the fertilizer N. So basically we're saying how much of the fertilizer nitrogen got into the grain. And there's different ways to calculate this, but this will be the definition that I use. And in their paper they estimated that worldwide nitrogen use efficiency in all cereal crops was about 33%. So 67% was going somewhere else. Now, we're not saying it was lost in leaching or runoff. I would say a large portion of that was probably tied up in soil organic matter, but it shows that we have very low nitrogen use efficiency. In developed countries like the United States, we expect NUs to be approximately 42% across all cereal grains. And my gut feeling, the last number there of 30 to 60%, that's based on me surveying people who work in this field, and most people will tell you it's somewhere between 30 and 60% for corn in the United States. And it would go up based on practice. If you split apply your nitrogen and you put down your side dress nitrogen on your corn as late as possible, and you're using a very accurate yield goal, you would be 60, 75% nitrogen use efficiency. Again, these are just averages. So in summary, Maryland's recommendations are based on mass balance approach with 1 pound of nitrogen per bushel grain. Applying the nitrogen when it's needed, when the crop's taken up, is the first step to increase NU. And environmental conditions influence our nitrogen use efficiency because nitrogen is so mobile. Wet or dry weather, warm springs can account for much higher mineralization. Soil type with higher organic matter or better nitrogen holding capacity, and previous management of the field. So that will lead us into adaptive nitrogen management. Definition that our work group came up with a couple years ago was that it's an ongoing process of developing improved management practices for efficient production and resource conservation by use of participatory learning through continuous systematic assessment. Participants include producers, ag service providers, policymakers, regulators, scientists, and other interested stakeholders. So that's a pretty broad definition. Really, it's real-time site-specific nutrient management in my mind. And in this, the producers, the data collector, and the investigator, we have these tools at our disposal now. This is one of the things that's really exciting about being involved with this today, is that we now have yield monitors. Our sprayers are logging how much fertilizer we're putting down. We can make maps of where and how much we're putting down, and we can overlay those over yield maps and soil maps. And so the producer really has the opportunity to be the investigator at this point by watching his data and seeing what his field's actual requirement is. Because remember, university recommendations are an average. So of all the plots that were involved in the studies to develop the nitrogen recommendations, by definition, half need it more and half need it less. What we're presenting is the mean nitrogen requirement. The producer has the opportunity to really narrow in on what is the correct rate through this adaptive process that looks like this. First, you have a nutrient management plan based on your yield goal or prior experience. You evaluate that system, and then you adjust the plan accordingly the following year. So how can you evaluate the system? Well, yield monitors would be the #1 tool. Did you yield what you expected to? A really powerful tool are nitrogen check strips. Put a strip in the field or 4 strips in the field with 50 pounds less nitrogen and 50 pounds more nitrogen. Use your yield monitor to see which one gave you the optimum yield. Do this a couple years in a row, and you might build a data set of your own where you can develop what is the right rate for that field on a flat rate basis. Cornstalk nitrate test. We use the PSNT to help us predict how much nitrogen we need, and we use yield goals to predict how much nitrogen we need. But a cornstalk nitrate test is an end-of-season evaluation. It shows if we have surplus nitrogen. And there's more information on that on the Ag Nutrient Management Program website. So all of these tools can be used as part of that adaptive management toolbox. But it's a systems approach aimed at managing soil N, kind of honing in on that site-specific approach, farmer-specific approach, and you can use PSNT, crop sensors, leaf chlorophyll meters, cornstalk nitrate tests, yield monitoring, and I'm sure there's other tools I haven't listed here. But the overall goal is to manage the nitrogen cycle. I took this from John Spargo and Jack Meisinger at USDA ARS in Beltsville. And they say that the goal of a system nitrogen use efficiency approach is to manage the nitrogen cycle, maximize our recovery of applied N or the investment, convert as much fertilizer nitrogen as we can into grain, and then conserve the balance as soil organic matter, minimize reactive nitrogen release to the environment, and build a slow release source of nitrogen that can be utilized in the future. So what is the right rate? This brings me into some of my current research, kind of where I want to go, and I guess this is the present and hopefully maybe the future of nitrogen management in corn, wheat, and perhaps other crops. Pictures of our spray coop that we use to apply these variable rate plots that we have outfitted with GreenSeeker active optical sensors. The GreenSeeker is just one brand of active sensor. You can use it as a handheld to assess crops and come up with a flat rate as indicated there. That's what the handheld unit looks like. The sensor head is the same. Here's a picture of a rig out in Oklahoma State. The sensors are mounted on the boom, and they can really apply a different rate of nitrogen to every individual corn plant using that system with multiple nozzles. And our system is just basically that spray coop you saw, and we're applying the same rate across the boom, but we're varying the rate and direction of travel as we move across the field. The sensor itself emits light in the red and near infrared, so it's flashing 60 times per second, and once per second it's sending an average of the reflected light. So it's emitting red and near infrared light, and then there's a sensor that collects reflected light, averaging that once per second and calculating the NDVI. Now this is for the Virginia Tech algorithm I'm going to be talking about. It's developed at Virginia Tech. They have a separate algorithm for wheat and corn. And it uses the Normalized Differential Vegetative Index. That's what NDVI stands for. This was developed in the 60s or so. It's very good at distinguishing between things that are plants and things that aren't plants. And it also tells you how much plant matter you have out there, or biomass, and it kind of tells you how healthy that biomass is. And it's simply a ratio of the reflected near-infrared light subtract red light over near-infrared plus red light. It's just a remote sensing tool that was developed for the Landsat program back in the 70s. It correlates this sensor reading to crop vigor and nitrogen need. And the important thing about it being an active optical sensor is that it's not sensitive to light conditions, atmospheric conditions, or crop variety. And we're going to talk a little bit about the reference strips that we put in that help with that. But I would say that this right here is one of the real important things to note about the active sensors, because before there were passive sensors, but cloud cover, daylight, sun angle, and we used to work with fixed wing imagery from airplanes and satellite imagery. I get a lot of questions about that. All of those things are affected by light conditions, whereas this is an active sensor generating its own light, so it's not affected by atmospheric conditions at the time you're sensing. And basically you drive your sprayer into the field, you check a reference strip that you've installed in the field, and then you just drive through the field, and it varies the nitrogen rate as you drive through the field. You have to put in some user inputs, which include days from planting, yield goal, and previous nitrogen applied. Let's see if I can turn off this and go back to that. There we go. Okay. The sensor inputs, at the start of the field, when you first drive into the field, you go over a high-end reference. So you basically, at the beginning of the season, right after planting, prior to planting in corn, you can do it, ahead of time. In wheat, I would wait until green up to do this. You want to put in a strip. People often ask me, how long does the strip have to be? Well, when I first started this, we tried pretty small strips because we didn't want to use a large area of the field. And it turns out I'm a really bad judge of where to place the strips. I always put it in an area that, when I came back to side dress, was in 2 feet of standing water and there was no corn there. So I would put it somewhere that's easy to access from the entrance of the field. The longer the better. You can put it out any way you want. You could go out by hand, which is what we do, and spread ammonium nitrate. You could come in with a sprayer with UAN, but the idea is to just make sure that when you pull in there to side dress your corn, the high-end strip has more than enough nitrogen. So we usually put out 100 extra pounds on that strip. The low-end strip, it's just what it says. Now this is very difficult, and this is normally what most farmers have a problem with. It would be really nice to have a strip in the field where there is no nitrogen as starter or with herbicide or whatever, but we put down nitrogen through so many other mechanisms, along with the herbicide as a carrier or whatever. It's hard to get that zero starter strip. And so what I say is you need to reduce the nitrogen somehow and have a lower end strip. You can kind of fudge this a little bit and use like the worst looking area of the field when you get to the field, but that's not really the way to do it. The best way to get the best response from the equipment is to have a true zero starter strip. That means no starter, no nitrogen prior to side dress. And that area can be pretty small. And then the sensor takes these two numbers and relates it to what it's actually looking at as you drive through the field, and in real time, every second, is demanding a new rate from the sprayer. So the algorithm kind of integrates the user inputs and the sensor inputs and computes a nitrogen need in real time every second as you're traveling across the field with your sprayer. The general approach of that algorithm. On this axis here is the prescribed nitrogen rate. This axis here is the NDVI that the sensor is managing. If you're down at this end of the NDVI scale, your corn is basically non-existent. And for the rest of the discussion, I'm basically going to just talk about corn, although this holds for other crops. At this end, you've got a really healthy, large biomass, big plants, good-looking stand of corn. And right in here is the average part of the field, kind of the middle-looking corn. And the Virginia Tech and Oklahoma State approach has been to reduce the nitrogen application on the poor-looking corn and put like a middle rate on the best-looking ground and the highest rate on that middle ground. So what's the theory behind this? Well, down here, this kind of bad-looking corn, our idea is we're not going to catch it up. Down here, we're not going to catch this grain up. It's something else has damaged the yield potential in that part of the field. Perhaps there's standing water there, it was drowned it out, or denitrification, or pest pressure, or it's just bad soil. And up here, we're getting some net nitrogen savings. A lot of people are surprised by this, but we're getting nitrogen savings on the best-looking part of the corn crop. Okay, and they say, that's my best ground. I want my highest rate on the best ground. Well, really, the reason it's your best ground is because it has a lower nitrogen requirement per bushel of grain. And so we're going to stop and think about that a little bit, because this is where people kind of start to question us. They have a little bit of problem with this part right here. You know, but really your best ground has the lowest nitrogen requirement. That's why it's your best ground. Now here is the interesting part of the algorithm. I'm going to come back to this. But as the user, when you pull into the field, you set a cap. You say, I don't want to go over 70 pounds per acre of nitrogen, and I don't want to go below 20 pounds per acre. Well, let's set it at 40. And so what happens is you set those caps in, and the algorithm is going to calculate, it's going to only allow the sprayer to put down a rate within those parameters. And so it'll go up, it'll stop there, it'll flat line at the cap you put in, and then come back down. So while the algorithm is saying it should be getting this much nitrogen, because of my nutrient management plan, I capped it off here. Now that's probably still higher than what your normal flat rate would be, because I would guess that your normal flat rate is right in here. So with your flat rate, you're over-fertilizing the poor corn, and you're over-fertilizing the good corn, and you're under-fertilizing the average part of the field when you're doing a standard flat rate according to university recommendations. And we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but if the equipment could jump between rates faster and we had better control, we kind of think perhaps we'd actually increase yield with this technology, because we'd be able to hit these rates up here in the middle part of the field and actually boost yield while cutting the overall nitrogen rate. But we're not quite there yet with the research we've been doing. So, I don't want everyone to get scared, but I've been kind of experimenting with the teaching the algorithm, because I feel like if you understand the algorithm, you really understand the technology. But when I say the word algorithm, when I start showing equations, people usually tune right out. As a matter of fact, this is what I don't like about this Connect session. I can't see all the people falling asleep or walking out of the room. So I'll just have faith that you're all still there. So the basics of the algorithm. We say if YPN is less than max yield, YPN is the yield with nitrogen. Okay? And max yield is the user parameter that you entered when you pulled up to your field. And you said this is the max yield, basically the yield goal, maybe a yield goal on the high end. If your yield goal is 130 bushels, you say, it's 130, but the good parts of this field are going to get 150. So you enter that in when you pull into the field. And then we say your nitrogen rate is equal to the yield with nitrogen minus the yield with no nitrogen, and that comes from the zero-end check strip. That's why that's important. And I'm going to show a little more detail on this later, but it's the yield with nitrogen minus the yield without nitrogen times the nitrogen content in the grain divided by nu plus a kind of a starter and fudge factor. But I'll get into that a little bit more. We'll break this down piece by piece. So the nitrogen rate, it says if YPN is less than max yield. So if my yield with nitrogen is less than my yield goal, use this equation, which this number right here comes from the sensor reading, okay? But if I'm greater than my yield goal, then the equation just inserts max yield in there. It doesn't use a calculated yield or predicted yield. And I'm going to talk about that in just a second. That's where I'm going with this. So I see we have one question. Heather, what's our question?
The question is, does the reference strip need to be 6 rows wide, or does it have to be the width of the applicator?
That's a good question, Heather. The width of the reference strip is determined by how you set your sprayer up and the size of your sprayer boom. You can set sections up in the software. So first of all, the equipment. I didn't talk about equipment, but I can cover it quickly. In our spray coop, we're using a Raven 440 controller. Trimble makes a rate controller called the FMX. If you're using an ag leader product like Insight, you would have to have a 440 in there because ag leader is fairly proprietary, and you can't tell ag leader what to do. So you got to have that 440 in there in between the ag leader and the boom. But you can set up the Green Seeker software and tell it how many boom sections you have. And let's say, like on ours, we have 6 sensors on our boom. We've got 3 on the left boom. I can tell it to just read from the left boom. So I could have it, since I got a 30-foot boom, I could make a 15-foot or 6-row reference strip. I can make it sprayer width, because what I do is when I'm reading my reference strips, I'm side dressing at the same time because I don't want to have to go over a part of the field twice. I turn it on a flat rate. I'm side dressing nitrogen while I'm reading my reference strip running down the field. So I make my reference strip a full 30-foot. You could also make it 10-foot or 5-foot and use a handheld sensor if you had one available to get the NDVI reading to enter that number. So it's really flexible. I would say the normal practice would be 1 boom on the 0 end strip because you don't want to limit yield on as much acreage, and maybe full width boom on the high end. But it's definitely flexible. All right. I'm going to move on and talk about these equations here and how they work. We're going to break them down piece by piece. So this is the part I don't want you to get turned off by. We're going to try and break it down real simple. Delta yield is the predicted yield with added nitrogen, YPN, and the predicted yield without added nitrogen, YPO. Okay, so YPN right here and YPO right here. So what would my corn yield with fertilizer with side dress, and what would my corn yield without? And the sensor is predicting those 2 numbers, plugging them into this equation to get your nitrogen rate. And it's based on biomass production per day, because remember, when you pull in the field, you told the sensors how many days since planting. So let's assume 45 days from planting. It's basically taking the sensor reading, which estimates crop biomass, how much plant material is in the field, and dividing it by days from planting. And then the smart folks at Oklahoma State University figured out a way to create a yield prediction for either if I side dress it or if I don't side dress it. And what does that look like? There's delta yield. This line right here is the yield with nitrogen, and this is the yield without nitrogen for each of these NDVI. So the x-axis is NDVI, the y-axis is the yield predicted in bushels per acre. Now, notice that it just keeps going up. So, it goes up to unrealistic yields up here because of the way that their equation works, it just keeps going up. And notice that the yield with nitrogen, as the NDVI gets higher, is growing faster than the yield without nitrogen as the NDVI gets higher.
They don't see that.
Mark. Okay. So right here is NDVI is yield predicted if I don't fertilize, and this is yield predicted if I do fertilize. And we see that they're getting further apart as I get further out on the NDVI scale. I'm marking up all over it, so I hope you all can see that, but I like being able to kind of show you what I'm talking about here. So that's the first statement. Let's back up and look at the equation. I've marked all over these. I think there's a clear button here somewhere.
Second from the bottom.
Second from the bottom, right? Yep. There we go. We'll clear all my markers so I can mark it up again. So that's the first statement. We're looking at yield with nitrogen, yield without nitrogen. And then that's these lines right here. Yield with nitrogen, yield without nitrogen. They separate more as we go further out. So that nitrogen's getting us more out here, the delta yield, because remember, we're going to subtract this line from this line, and that's delta yield. But then there's an else statement. Because YPN and YPO keep going up to unrealistic yields, we've got to cut it off. So when the yield with nitrogen prediction exceeds what I put in as my max possible yield, the computer's just going to drop that number you gave it in there as a user input. And what does that do for us? Well, it creates this blue line. So since YPO is constantly increasing and max yield is a fixed value, this line will constantly decrease. So this is delta yield. So in this yellow line here, what I've done is subtracted YPO from YPN. So there's two lines before. I subtracted at each point, one from the other. And this is basically how it predicts the yield relative to NDVI. And then it converts that to a nitrogen rate. First, we take delta yield, in other words, bushels per pound of nitrogen. That's what this part of the equation is, delta yield. And it multiplies it times PN, which is the nitrogen content in the grain. We just use average book values for that. It's already in the equation. You don't have to know that. Divided by nitrogen use efficiency. And you can tweak this in the field. The standard value is 0.5, which we're saying 50% of the nitrogen is going to the grain. The rest is going to the stalk, or is lost somewhere, or stays in the soil, but only 50% is getting in the grain. If you tweak that number when you're sitting there at the field, you can see what it's going to do to your application before you even start side dressing. So that's something you can play with in the field. This isn't quite auto steer. You've got to think a little bit if you're going to use this technology. And then finally, we add in here, now the guys that developed the algorithm don't like me calling this, but the short answer is it's a fudge factor. They just figured out that you need about another 100 pounds of nitrogen to make this whole thing work. Okay? And so what this says is we take 100 pounds minus whatever your starter was, and we add that into the rate. Now there's good science behind this, so it's not really a fudge factor. I'm not going to get into detailing how they came up with this number of 100. But basically you need another 100 pounds besides what the equation predicts to get you to that N rate. So using this equation, every second the sprayer will change the rate going through the field. And this is the final output. Nitrogen rate versus NDVI. NDVI is how tall is my corn basically, and nitrogen rate, we all know what that is, in pounds per acre. And see how this matches that general algorithm I showed before where it goes up and then back down. So there's the general algorithm, and that's how it's arrived at. Now, we've got a few minutes left. I have a few more slides. Does anyone else have any questions about the equation? If so, let Heather know, type them in the chat room there. I want to make sure that everyone gets this algorithm, so I'm willing to stop now and take questions about how the computer predicts nitrogen rate based on these factors. I don't see anything popping up, so I'm going to move on. But if you have a question about that, I want to make sure, that's really the heart of this whole matter. I want you to understand mathematically and agronomically how we're arriving at this nitrogen rate using this equipment, because I feel like it's very important. And we've got a couple of farmers with this equipment out there in the field now, and I feel like they get a lot more comfortable with it when they know exactly why. It's not magic. There's really sound agronomy behind this, how this rate is calculated. It's all based on that delta yield concept. So, how was this validated? Starting back in 2000, actually this number's outdated, but there were 60 sites across Virginia, Delaware, and Maryland. There's more than that now. Irrigated, non-irrigated ground, conventional and no-till, whatever the rotation, whatever the pre-plant, whatever the farmer practice was, we go in and we put down farmer practice side dress nitrogen, and we put down green seeker controlled nitrogen. Replicate it 4 or 5 times. Collect all sorts of measurements and look at grain yield, and just straight up, how does the standard farmer practice match the green seeker performance? Dating back to 2000, they've been doing this, we've been working on it. And in corn, the average performance is yield stays the same between the two management practices. We apply about 20% less nitrogen with the green seeker. In wheat, it's about 7% less nitrogen because we're already managing our wheat a little bit tighter, and there's not as much room for variance. So if you're only putting down 30 pounds of nitrogen, you can't vary it plus or minus 30 pounds. You can only vary it plus or minus 10 pounds, whereas in corn we can vary a lot more because we're saving a lot more nitrogen until that side dress period. And like I said, this yield component over here, we kind of want to start thinking about maybe we can increase our yield with this tool by upping that cap if the sprayer can get from the low rate to the high rate better. Now our old spray coop's not going to do such a hot job of it, but there's equipment out there that can. And so that's a real potential to really start increasing our nitrogen use efficiency, not only by decreasing nitrogen applied, but also increasing yield. And I think that's that's where this is going, the direction that we want to take it here in the next couple of years. Jump the slide down. Now, I've kind of focused on the positive, accentuated the positives up to this point, but I want to talk about some of the limitations and challenges with this technology. We know a lot of farmers like to go out and apply their nitrogen side dress corn at V4, about 12-inch corn, right? Well, that's earlier than the corn needs it, but there's good sound agronomy behind that practice. If you've got 1,000 acres of nitrogen to jump on and you start at V7, you've only got a couple weeks before the corn's too tall for you to get through it. And then what happens if you have a rainstorm and you lose 3 days? You're never going to cover all your ground. So we start earlier at V4 in order to give us a long enough window to account for the possibility of rain or sprayer breaks down or whatever, run out of nitrogen. Gives us a couple extra days. So, you know, it gives us a cushion. Well, the sensor needs a pretty good canopy. So we'd like to see it V5 or V6 at least before you're going to get that 20% savings. The other thing is when you go out at V4, remember we've got, if you've set up for your green seeker sensor, this is something else, even if you don't have sensors, you can do it. It's pretty interesting. You've got your N-rich strip, your N-deficient strip, and the rest of the field that got normal starter. Well, when those 3 parts of the field all are the same height, that means you haven't outgrown your zero starter strip, right? So zero starter N was enough if they're all the same greenness, have the same NDVI. Well, then your regular starter and your 100 pounds extra of starter are going to outgrow that zero low end strip at some point. And that's the point you start digging into your fertilizer N. You've outgrown the soil supply, you've dug into your fertilizer N. And then when the N-rich strip separates from the fertilizer strip, the normal rest of the field, then you start digging into that extra nitrogen. You've passed your starter N for whatever reason. So, you know, you can wait until V5, V6, but if you start at V4, everything looks the same to the sensor because everything's just working off of soil and it hasn't even gotten into the fertilizer N. So you don't see many difference, so you don't save a lot of money, right? So you're not paying for your equipment if you go in too early with the green seeker. So that's the first thing. Farmers like to go in early, and we really should be waiting until at least V5, V6. Although I will say, I've met a lot of less resistance to this in the agricultural community as more and more people get larger equipment that can cover more ground faster and go through taller corn. This doesn't seem to be as much of an issue anymore. Check strips. They're a big pain in the butt, according to most people. However, I will say that most people that have tried them, after they try them, it wasn't as big a deal. Now, with some of the large companies that do a lot of side dressing, this is an issue for them because they say, well, the farmer's handling planting and I'm doing side dressing. How do I get that check strip in? And all I can say is you got to figure out how to do it if you want to use the technology. They have a lot of benefits outside the sensors as well, but it's something that you have to figure out for your own operation, and especially the low-end check strip, because it really increases the accuracy of that algorithm. Remember, it's very important in developing that predicted yield. And so if you're just guessing at what a zero-end treatment would have gotten you, then your data is not good that's in behind you. So all I can say is, yes, it's difficult, but it's necessary if you want to save 20% on your nitrogen bill. Skepticism. That's the big one. I mean, just because I tell people it works doesn't mean they're going to trust it. So we've got to overcome that. And it's like any other technology. As this expands, I think people will become more comfortable with it. And then sometimes, you know, things happen. I'll get in a field with my green seeker and I'll enter all the parameters, and I don't like the application graph. So I need to tweak or kind of lie to it a little bit, fake a little bit, to get it to look like what I want it to. Now, most of the time after the fact, when I look at the yield, turns out that what the algorithm wanted to do was right and I was wrong. But that comes back to this skepticism. Even I, after working with it so much, am a skeptic. And so sometimes you got to have your brain engaged. You can't just run out there and let the sprayer do what it wants to do. You got to be thinking about it if you're going to use this technology. This is just performance at one site that I had from 2009. It might be a little bit hard for some of you to see on the screen, so I'm going to describe it. The blue line that is jogging up and down there, let me turn off my pen and turn on my arrow. So the blue line that's going up and down really fast is, let me jump this up to full screen. There we go. That's great. Okay, so that blue line that's bouncing up and down, everybody getting seasick from the pointer jumping around? The blue line is the what is the prescribed rate. So remember, every second the sensor is prescribing a new rate. And it jumps around because every second, I mean, it's getting a different NDVI reading. It's jumping around pretty dramatically. But if we look at the purple line that's overlaid, that's a lot smoother, that's what my sprayer is actually delivering, is that purple line. And so what we see is that we're following the general trend. As NDVI, or as the nitrogen rate that's needed goes up, the sprayer is following it. When it comes back down, the sprayer follows it. Now, the big jumps here that you see in this data set, each one of these peaks, that's where I'm running across into different plots. I'm starting and stopping with the spray coop, so it's catching the rate. So those, you wouldn't see that in a normal field. Couple of them might be ditches also that I cross. You know, you jump to a pretty high rate when you hit a ditch as you shift gears. But in general, we're following the general direction of what the green seeker is calling for. So even with our old spray coop, we've managed to do a pretty good job. So, summary on the sensors. Active sensors can be used in many crops. I've talked mostly about corn, a little bit about wheat. We've got some folks that might be getting some sensors next year that grow vegetables, and they've asked us to work on algorithms for cucumbers, snap beans, limas. Totally possible, and be very, I think, you probably get a higher return on your investment in this vegetable crops, because if you look at issue with say beans or limas or snap beans, if you over apply nitrogen, you get more vine and fewer beans. You know, it becomes a vinier crop. Same thing with cucumbers. So if we could design an algorithm that cuts back that nitrogen rate where we don't need it, we could limit that vine production. These sensors have seen widespread use with the cotton industry in applying growth regulators, because cotton's the same thing. They apply growth regulators to the parts of the field that are doing really well to slow that stem production. The sensors will allow us to reduce the nitrogen applied while maintaining the same yield. Someday I hope maybe we'll be able to say we're beating the yield and reducing the nitrogen applied. And again, multiple other uses maybe. You know, can we use these to target fungicides, growth regulators, mapping of fields, all of these things? You know, you're out spraying your soybeans, you're not applying nitrogen, but you can have the sensors turned on, be mapping it, looking for problems in that soybean field. They produce, NDVI is a great tool for looking at crop health. So just the mapping function alone is very valuable. So what do we learn? Nitrogen management basics. Mass balance is only a starting point. We need to improve nitrogen management because we're missing the season-to-season differences and spatial differences within a field in a given season, and we need to increase nitrogen use efficiency. I mean, folks, we can do better than 50% nitrogen use efficiency. There's no question about it. And we introduced the concept of adaptive management as a process to adjust your practices based on site-specific and season-specific feedback. And finally, active sensors and variable rate nitrogen, they can reduce nitrogen inputs while maintaining yield. There are multiple algorithms available. Now, this is a key point that I didn't talk about. We use the Green Seeker sensor. It allows you to enter custom algorithms, and it comes preloaded with, I don't know, 100 or more, hundreds of algorithms from all over different universities. We've tested the Virginia Tech algorithm, and that's what we stand behind here at the University of Maryland. We haven't tested any other algorithms. There are two other sensor companies I know of, and there might be others out there. So Trimble makes the Green Seeker. AgLeader has a relationship with Holland Scientific, and they market that under the trade name OptRx or Optrix. As far as I know, in the Optrix, there's only one algorithm, so you can't load the Virginia Tech algorithm. You got to use their corn algorithm. And I've never evaluated the algorithm, but to be perfectly honest, I've looked at it in the research papers, and I don't think it's a very good idea as far as the algorithm. The sensors, technology, to me, it's all the same. And then the third sensor package is Yara. Has worked with another company to develop a sensor. They're mostly overseas, although I heard 2 years ago they were going to be releasing a product in the United States, but I haven't seen it on the streets yet. And then one last point, we need to increase nitrogen use efficiency. We have huge and growing demand for food, fiber, and energy globally. Really, we have U.S. fertilizer dependence, which is equivalent to food dependence. People might not like to hear that, but you know, 50 to 55% of our nitrogen is probably imported in this country. So that's a huge amount of our food and fiber production in the United States. It's dependent on foreign source of fertilizer. And then the farm bottom line, obviously, to the individual producer, that's what matters, and also being good stewards of the land and water resources through reducing nitrogen losses. Because if you're targeting the nitrogen rate to where the crop needs it, even if you're applying the same nitrogen rate, forget the cuts in nitrogen, just targeting the nitrogen where it's needed, you're going to reduce those environmental loss of nitrogen. And certainly, if you're applying 20% less nitrogen and you're applying it where it needs to be in the field, there's got to be some environmental benefit there. With that, I want to make sure I thank our sponsors, the Maryland Soybean Board, the Maryland Grain Producers Utilization Board, NRCS, and Cooperative Extension have all contributed to this work. Greg Binford at the University of Delaware, Phil Ron at Oklahoma State University, and Wade Thomason down at Virginia Tech, Steve Phillips at IPNI. These guys right here are the ones that developed the algorithm and have been very helpful. Bill's the guy that kind of came up with the whole concept of using these for nitrogen management. There's my contact information. Now, Heather, do we have any questions?
We do have one that came in, and the question is, how or can we use this tool with a field that has received a manure application prior to planting? Since it's side dress time, we might not be seeing the need for nitrogen yet.
Manure's tricky, and we've used our green seeker with manured fields. I would probably at this juncture, because the research is limited on this green seeker application in manured field, I would also want a PSNT involved. So I'd go out and take the PSNT. I wouldn't give up on that yet. And that's really going to be a yes-no decision with the PSNT. So if the PSNT says go ahead and side dress to your nutrient management plan, then you can go through with the green seeker, and I'd be perfectly confident because you get to set the parameters. Remember, you set a floor and you set a max that it doesn't go over and it doesn't go under. And so it's going to vary in between there. Now, it doesn't matter whether you're using manure or regular starter nitrogen. The more nitrogen that you put up front, the less room you have to vary with the sensor, so the less your savings in nitrogen. So the lower that manure application or that starter or that herbicide or whatever, the nitrogen that's applied before side dress, the lower that rate is, the more responsive the sensors are going to be because of the greater differences between crops and because they have more room to move. I mean, if they have a 100-pound difference they can swing around on, you're going to get a lot more savings than if they're only bouncing around. If you're going out and your nutrient management plan says to apply 15 gallons to the acre, okay, then you don't have much room to swing around in. So, I had a farmer contact me recently about using the green seeker, and the way he was fertilizing everything, that's his planned rate is right around 12 gallons at side dress. And all other things aside, I'd say just from a straight flat rate perspective, you're not really getting the efficiency to pay for that fuel in the second trip if you're side dressing that low. But that aside, I told him the green seeker wasn't for him if that's the way he was going to fertilize, because you need that room to move. And that's the biggest problem we see with manure. I've used it in a couple manure fields. It worked fine. We saw pretty big nitrogen savings. And honestly, the green seeker, we forced it by, in one of our manure fields this summer, we tweaked some numbers because it said don't apply any nitrogen. We tweaked some numbers. We forced it to apply a little bit of nitrogen. We varied. We applied less than the farmer applied. Got the same yield, and we had a zero end plot that we did not side dress in that field, and it yielded just as well as the sensor plot and the farmer plot. So the sensor was right. We didn't need nitrogen there. Typically the sensors are right. And that's the handheld sensor is great for manure because you can use it like a PSNT. But we haven't done a lot of research with that here in Delaware.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Many of you probably have heard a good portion of what I'm going to talk about this afternoon during the winter meetings. There are a couple of new slides that I've added. So we're doing some technical things here. I guess we're okay. There are a couple slides in there that will be new. But otherwise, many of you, like I said, have probably seen this before. What we're going to be talking about is wheat nitrogen management. There will be 3 sections to our discussion this afternoon. The first is capitalizing on this residual nitrate issue and the development of a fall nitrate test to determine what you have following corn harvest. Second topic will be wheat following soybeans, and the third topic will be the spring nitrogen timing issue. Before I start, though, I do want to draw your attention to the fella who's in the picture there. That is Patrick Forrestal. Much of the work that was done for the first topic was done by Patrick. He's been working on his PhD for the last 5 years. He's currently in the process of writing his dissertation, and in fact will be defending 2 weeks from today. But I do want to recognize Patrick for the work that he has accomplished and where we have gotten today. Get down to the slide. And I also want to recognize the 2 organizations who funded the research that I will be talking about this afternoon, and that was the Maryland Grain Producers and the Maryland Soybean Board, and I appreciate that their contributions very much. It does a lot to fund my program as well as the other extension specialists on campus. Let's start the discussion by talking about corn and the residual nitrogen issue that we frequently face in Maryland. The chart on the right describes corn yields for the past 11 years, average yield across the state. And you can see we have peaks and valleys. The valleys, of course, are from years when we've had a drought. The last season, 2010, was one of those years. The reason why we have these peaks and valleys is because we have variable precipitation, and that causes our yields to fluctuate. In order to optimize your nitrogen rate, you're limited in your timing, and the last opportunity you have is about mid-June when you're putting on your side dress nitrogen. Now there's a lot that happens weather-wise from that date on, and because we can't predict what's going to happen, our yields vary a great deal because of that. This leaves us with a considerable amount of variable amounts of nitrate in the soil once we harvest that corn. Now, one of the things that can be done is take advantage of that nitrate when we plant our wheat. If we have an adequate amount, perhaps we don't need any fall nitrogen. However, the only real true measurement of that is a soil sample. And collecting soil samples that time of the year, a lot of folks are hesitant because, one, it takes time to send the sample off to the lab for analysis, and we frequently have a relatively short window between corn harvest and wheat planting. Now this project actually set out to try to determine if we can use some corn or plant-based measurements to identify what that residual nitrogen would be in the fall. In other words, monitoring the crop during the season and to see if it will give us some indication of what that performance or what the amount of residual nitrogen will be. We looked at everything from simply the firing of the leaves in the canopy. I'm sure you've all seen how nitrogen deficiency appears in corn. The oldest leaves will show symptoms first. They will be the ones that will yellow, and then they move upwards in the plant as the deficiency increases with the yellowing of the leaves getting closer to the ear leaf. We simply went out at various times during the season and counted leaves to see if that would be a determiner. We used chlorophyll meter to see if it would be an indicator of residual nitrogen. We used optical sensors like Josh was describing in the previous presentation to see if that could be an indicator. We also looked at the cornstalk nitrate test. I'm sure many of you have heard of that test. It's basically a post-mortem test. You collect corn stalks from about 6 to 8 inches above the ground, a 6-inch sample. You then analyze those to get some indication of how much residual nitrate is tied up in that corn stalk. That is actually a sink for nitrate as the corn plant accumulates it before it distributes it into the plant. And we thought maybe that would be a very good indicator. We took all of those various plant-based measurements, we compared them to our soil samples, and what we determined was that none of them were really as good a measurement as a soil test would be. Now, of course, the state has established the cover crop program to help take care of this residual nitrogen issue that we frequently face. And in fact, in 2006, it added another piece to that cover crop program in the form of the commodity cover crop program, which pays farmers an incentive in the fall to plant a small grain. However, it restricts you to no fall nitrogen and no spring nitrogen until March 1. Now, of course, the acreage in the cover crop program since its inception has increased. Oh, I got to go down here. All right. And in fact, this last year we had a record-setting year for the planting of cover crop acreage. Approximately 400,000 acres were planted of the 500,000 acres that were signed up during June of 2010. Pretty remarkable feat. However, maybe it wasn't so remarkable given the fact that our corn crop was pretty much drought impacted across the state last year, and folks were able to get out and get cover crops planted in a timely manner. So let's look at this issue of absorbing nitrogen by both cover crops and a commodity planted wheat. What you're seeing right now is a slide that shows two different seasons of nitrogen uptake. This was actually a cover crop planting technique study that we conducted in 2007 and 2008. All of the bars left of where I have my circles were broadcast seeding techniques for cover crops. What I want you to focus on are the two circled sets of bars. 2007 was a year that corn crop was short because of drought at this particular farm, 106 bushel crop. They fertilized for 140 bushel crop. They had a considerable amount of residual nitrate remaining in the fall. There's the pointer, there it is, okay. This planting date was prior to October 1, which would be the sort of the highest premium date for cover crop. This planting date was October 10th, which is sort of an average date for planting wheat for commodity purposes. And what you see there in both of these situations is a considerable amount of nitrate consumed by the following April from that field where there was a great deal of residual nitrate remaining following the harvest of the corn. And of course, only a couple weeks later, commodity type crop, you can see that it consumed nearly 40 pounds of nitrogen by the following spring. The second year, 2008, gives you a real good indication of how much residual nitrate is there following a year where you optimized consumption of your nitrogen. Fertilized for 140 bushel crop, had 134 bushel to the acre, pretty much consumed all the nitrate by the time the crop was harvested, and for the most part across all the treatments it was about 15 to maybe 18 pounds of nitrogen that was consumed by the following April. And again, here we have here is the prior to October 1 planting date, and here is the October 10th planting date. Again, the commodity crop was consuming nearly as much as the cover crop was consuming. All right, let's discuss this issue of not using any starter N. If you participate in the commodity cover crop program, you're going to get paid $25 an acre to do so. However, questions that I get are, will I lose money by not using any fall in? Am I going to be sacrificing some yield? Is there a way to know which fields will be the most responsive to this? And more recently, with the TMDL issue, the question has arisen as, can this be a way to reduce nitrogen loading and not reduce farm profitability? And in fact, when Maryland, at the state level, released its WIP, the Watershed Implementation Plan, this past January, one of the comments that was added to that was, you can see it in red there, was that starting the fall of 2011, Maryland plans to discontinue fall fertilization of small grains unless the soil test deems that it is needed. All right, let's look at wheat growth and nitrogen uptake. And of course, the university's recommendation for fall nitrogen has been none if you have an adequate amount of residual N present. And if you don't have an adequate amount present, then 20 to 40 pounds. Now, this is rarely followed. Let's look at the period of time from planting of the wheat through the winter. And what we have here is a chart that along the y-axis are various dates, and on the x-axis, or on the y-axis, we have consumption of nitrogen or nitrogen uptake in pounds of nitrogen per acre per day. We have a planting date of October 15th. I can't, where's that pointer? There it is.
No, you were selected. You just have to just deselect.
Okay. We have a planting date of October 15th, and we travel through most of the winter. You can see that we have a relatively low amount of consumption of nitrogen. And then once we hit this green up period in the spring, and through the rest of the spring up to the heading of the crop is when we have the major portion of consumption of our nitrogen. So back to this issue of the fall, the question is, how much soil N is enough in the fall so that I can not put out any fall nitrogen? And then, of course, our recommendation follows up with a spring application of split N, with the first portion of it going out at green up, the second portion going out at joining of the crop. In order to answer the question about the need for fall nitrogen, we started with the corn crop. We actually established plots in the field that had 4 different nitrogen rates on the corn, a 0 rate. We had 2 rates that we felt were reasonably close to what farmers' use would be, and then we had an excessive rate. With the 0 rate, what we were hoping to do was have no residual N or very low levels of residual nitrate in the fall when we harvested the corn. With the excessive rate, we were hoping that we would have residual nitrate that we could measure, and then follow all of these situations with wheat. In fact, we established our corn plots, we harvested the wheat. First thing we did after harvesting the corn was we took soil samples to measure how much residual nitrate N we had. And we took those soil samples to a depth of 24 inches or 2 feet. We had increments of 0 to 6, 6 to 12, and 12 to 24. We then planted wheat into each of those previous corn nitrogen treatments. And the nitrogen rates we used on the wheat in the fall were a 0, and then we had 3 treatments with fall nitrogen, 15, 30, and depending upon location, a high rate of either 45 or 60 pounds of N per acre. Our management in the spring was uniform. We put on our first split at March 1. We didn't go before March 1 because we were trying to stay within the regulations of the commodity cover crop program. And our second split went on at joining. Our splits included 50 pounds at the green up or March 1 date and 50 pounds at joining. We weren't trying to limit the crop in nitrogen. We were just trying to see what the effect of fall nitrogen had for the crop. Had a total of 21 site years with this study over the 5-year period, and we had both silt loam and sandy loam soil types. Now, does wheat respond to starter nitrogen? And the answer most definitely is yes. This chart right here, along the x-axis, you have the 4 nitrogen rates we had, fall fertilizer nitrogen rates, yield response. On our y-axis, we saw our best response with 30 pounds of nitrogen in the fall. But that response was relatively modest, about 3.5 bushel per acre on average. Now, I do want to add that the chart that you're seeing was just 16 site years. We picked those locations where we had residual nitrate in the fall less than 15 parts per million. For this comparison, we threw out the 5 locations where we had greater than that amount of residual nitrate in the fall. All right, let's look at comparison between the use of 30 pounds of nitrogen in the fall compared to no starter. Every one of these dots is the comparison between those 2 plots at every location. There's about 225 of them on the screen. If you look at the 0 line right there, below that line was a yield loss. Below that line was a yield gain when we used starter nitrogen. If you look across the y-axis, what you're seeing is the amount of soil nitrate that we had in the fall. Everything from relatively low amounts, less than 10 parts per million, where, as you can see, a good portion of the sites and the plots fell within. And then we had some cases, drought year, our high corn nitrogen fertilizer plots that had fairly high amounts of residual nitrogen. Now, there's a cost to applying that nitrogen in the fall, not only for the cost of the nitrogen, but also the application. If you throw in a bar for where the profitability, or you're going to have a profitable return, it's at about 3.5 bushel to the acre. Everything above that red line was a profitable outcome. Everything below it cost you money to use that fall nitrogen. So how do we identify, or what is a sufficiency level? How do we determine where our most profit will be made? Well, the only recommendation that currently exists comes out of Virginia Tech, and their recommendation is that at 30 parts per million or greater, 30 parts per million is the equivalent to about 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre in the surface half foot of soil. Beyond that point, they say you will not see a response to fall nitrogen. I agree with that. However, there is a considerable amount of area here in the profitability zone. We go from this line here to this line here. That's the quadrant we want to look at, where we don't really have a response. So I say the sufficiency level, based upon where we really increase our profitability, in this quadrant right here, is 10 parts per million, or 20 pounds of nitrogen, residual nitrate in the fall, for surface 6 inches. Another way of looking at this profitability is with this bar chart, and we simply have every location, the 21 locations that we had over the 5 years, and we have either positive yield occurring from above the 0 line or yield loss occurring if it's below the 0 line. If we throw in the profitability line for the average cost of nitrogen, which over the past 5 years has been 48 cents a pound, and the average wheat price, $4.41 a bushel, there was only 1/3 of the time that we had a profitable outcome. Now, let's have a little bit more realistic profitability line. Same Cost of nitrogen, 48 cents a pound, but wheat prices are much closer to $7 a bushel than the 5-year average. And that profitability line indicates that 50% of the time you would have had a profitable response. In other words, the decision to use 30 pounds of nitrogen in the fall can be made as easily by pulling a coin out of your pocket and flipping it as almost any other system you have. Now, if you've decided to use fall nitrogen, in either of those situations there, you already have a cost involved in the crop, and you've also opted out of the commodity cover crop program. What the black line shows you is the profitability line that it would take to pay for the fertilizer that you use by opting out of the program and then leaving that $25 an acre on the table. In that situation, only 10% of the time would you have had enough response with the use of fall in to pay for that. All right, let's talk about measuring that residual nitrate. We're back to a soil sample. Is there an easier way to do it than collecting the samples, sending it off to the lab? And in fact, there is. We compared the soil samples that we pulled on our, and then ran on our $100,000 machine here on campus, our Latchet, with the results that we got when we took those same samples and checked them using the Nitrate colorimetric quick test. Many of you are probably familiar with this test kit. It's the same kit that's used to measure PSNT samples for corn. In this chart right here, what you are seeing is the comparison between our lab samples with the Nitrate kits, and we had a very good correlation. One of the concerns was at this lower level of residual nitrate, which in many cases we may see if we've optimized the use of our nitrogen during the season, that there would be too much noise to allow us to use this system, but it doesn't appear that that is going to be the case. And of course, these quick test kits and the analysis is available at the local extension offices. So the next question is, how deep do you soil sample, or where is that residual nitrate when you harvest the corn? Got a couple of different soil types we're going to look at. First, we're going to look at a silt loam soil, good corn fertilizer use year, 2008. On the right, we've got the same soil type, but it was a poor corn fertilizer use year. In other words, we had a drought situation that limited our yield. Here on the left is the good year. We have our residual nitrate broken down in the increments that we sampled, 6 inches, our 6-inch to 12-inch amount, and our 12-inch to 24-inch amount. The total amount that was accounted for was about 30 pounds remaining in the fall in the surface 2 feet of soil. Now, on the right, you can see that we have considerably more nitrate. Again, the surface 6 inches has the highest amount because it was a poor corn fertilizer use year. We have nearly 45 pounds, and that is using kind of these two corn end treatments, the 120 and the 180 pound rates. As we move down through the profile, there's less. So based upon that, we decided that 6-inch sample measuring in the surface 6 inches is going to tell us enough information about what is in the profile and will be an adequate sample area to measure our residual nitrate for this fall test. Now, where is this N by late winter? First, we're looking at that good corn fertilizer end response year 2008, silt loam soil. Here on the left, we've got our 30 pounds total. By the end of the winter, we can account for 22 pounds of that total. Now, what you will see in these lines is twice as many lines here as over here. And the difference is we had 0 fall nitrogen on the wheat, and we had 30 pounds of fall nitrogen on the wheat. As you get down to the 1 or the 2 foot zone, the 1 to 2 foot zone, you can see that some of these rates start spreading apart, and that's simply the difference between that one right there was 30 pounds of nitrogen in the fall following the high corn nitrogen treatment. There's the 0 fall nitrogen treatment. However, we didn't have a lot in the fall, and we're accounting for a good portion of that by late winter. Early February is when we were getting our soil samples. This was a year in which we had about 13 inches of precipitation, which is fairly normal during that period of time. Now, let's look at that poor corn fertilizer N response year. In that year, the chart on the left here, we had 95 pounds of N that we were accounting for in the surface 2 feet. By the time we got to February, you can see the distribution had changed. It had moved to less in the surface, more further down in the soil profile, and what we were accounting for was 27 to 42 pounds of that total 95 pounds at that point in time in February. So where did that nitrogen go? You would hope that you were utilizing it by the small grain crop, by the wheat, but we still have 50 to 80 pounds of nitrogen that we can't account for. All right, now let's look at sandy textured sites. We're getting probably to a little more poorer situation, or a greater opportunity for loss of that nitrogen. Okay, this was the good corn fertilizer N response year, 2008. What we were accounting for when we harvested the corn was 66 pounds of nitrogen remaining in the surface 2 feet. By the time we got through the winter, look at how little we had left in our surface 6 inches, our surface foot, and our 1 to 2 foot depths. Only about 14 pounds was remaining. So what happened to the other 50 to 80 pounds? And the year where we had very poor corn performance had roughly 180 pounds of nitrogen remaining in the surface 2 feet when we harvested the corn. And over here, by the time we had gone through winter, and it wasn't an overly wet winter, 9.5 inches, which is probably a little on the dry side almost, but that distribution had moved from the surface down through the profile, and depending upon whether or not you used 30 pounds in the fall or didn't use 30 pounds in the fall, have the question, where is the other 150 to 180 pounds of nitrogen? Considerable amount of loss. Now, it could be that at 3 feet, 4 feet, that's where it is. We didn't sample below that. I think this is a good place to stop. Heather, if there's any questions, we can try to address them at this point in time before I move into the rest of the presentation. Do I need to? Okay. Oh, yeah, that's right.
I don't see any questions at this time. Remember, if you guys have questions, go ahead and type them into the chat pod on the left side of your screen. It says questions for presenters. You can send them to everyone, or you can use the menu there to choose just the presenters, or you can send them just to me, and then I'll ask them. But Dr. Cradaville, at this time, I don't see any questions coming in.
Yeah, we had a question here, Heather. Paul Shipley asked if we did any plant sampling at the point in time that we collected the soil samples in February, and the answer is no, we did not. In hindsight, that would have been a real good thing to have done, but we just simply didn't do so. I guess we can forge forward then if there are no further questions, and at the end of the presentation there will be another opportunity if anyone has any. The next portion of the presentation is going to cover this question of what about wheat following soybeans? Is fall nitrogen necessary in that situation? You see a picture of a plot area there on your screens. It's a number of different maturity groups of soybeans, everything from an early maturity group 2 to a mid maturity group 4 bean was in this study. It gave us a real good opportunity to look at wheat performance following this, as we had large enough plots that we could divide them in half after we harvested our soybeans and put fall nitrogen on one half and no nitrogen on the other half. And in fact, that's what we did when we harvested the beans. The first thing that we did after harvesting the beans was get a soil sample. And that's what you're seeing on the screen there, is the results of, in the yellow bars, the results of the fall soil samples. How much nitrate did we see for each of the maturity groups, ranging from a group 2 to a group 4.5. And for the most part, as maturity increased, we saw a decline in the amount of nitrate that remained behind. And that makes perfect sense, because the earlier varieties in some cases were mature by Labor Day. We have fairly warm periods of weather following that period of time and had a good amount of mineralization of some of the root material, the nodules, etc., that contributed to those nitrate pools. We then, as I said, split the plots. The red bars indicate how much nitrogen we had following the no-fall nitrogen. We came back in during the winter in February, got our soil samples. The green bars is how much residual nitrate we had where we put the 30 pounds of N. As you can see, there's no difference in each of those comparisons as to the amount of nitrogen you had. Now, you would hope that the wheat crop consumed the nitrogen and you'd see a yield response. However, that wasn't the case. We actually saw less than 1 bushel per acre yield advantage where we used the 30 pounds of N and this was the average over 3 locations. All locations performed similarly those first 2 years. Now, in 2009, we had a little different situation. 2009, if you remember, was very wet fall, extremely wet. We again got our soil samples in the fall after we harvested the beans, but as you can see, we have very little residual nitrate in the surface 6 inches for any of the maturity groups that we were looking at. In fact, what we're seeing there is about 4 pounds of residual nitrate in the surface 6 inches of soil. What kind of yield response did we get that year? Well, in fact, we actually saw about 2 bushel the acre more where we didn't use any fall in. 2 location average, the 2 locations performed very similarly, so I've just bulked them together. Yield certainly wasn't anything to brag about that year, but that was more a factor of the very wet fall limiting the ability of stands to be established for the wheat than it was regarding the differences between fall in, no fall in. In fact, that was a year where you put your fall in out, that there was a very good possibility that it had moved through the profile below the root zone and was not used by the wheat crop. Okay, the last topic I'm going to cover this afternoon is this question of spring end timing. Folks say, all right, I can't put it on in the fall. They're making me wait until March 1 to put my first application out. I'm worried that my wheat's going to be hungry before March 1 occurs. Now, of course, the university's recommendation is that you top dress at green up. Cover crop program will not allow you to do it until March 1. Do these dates coincide? And no, they don't. And that's because years, locations differ for the planting dates, which means you have accumulation of growing degree days that are different. We'll talk more about this growing degree day concept in a couple slides down the road here. When do you typically plant your wheat? Hessian fly-free date is the date that I'm sure many of you are familiar with as using that time to plant wheat. For commodity purposes, if you're planting a wheat for cover crop purposes, the earlier you plant it, the better to get as much consumption of residual nitrate as you possibly can. But using fly-free date for commodity purposes really works very well to get the optimum amount of growth you want for the wheat during the fall into winter. And what is this date? Well, it varies across the state, and that's where we get this difference in planting dates depending upon where you're located in the state. It's about a 2-week range. You can start the end of September if you're out in the western part of the state around the Hagerstown area, and if you're on the lower shore, it's recommended that you don't start until about October 10 or October 12. Now, wheat responds to temperature, and it will grow when the temperature is 32 degrees or greater. And in fact, you can measure growth of wheat just like you do growth of corn using a growing degree day accumulation formula. Formula is the same. You take your maximum daily temperature, you add your minimum daily temperature, you divide it by 2, or you get the average for the day, and instead of subtracting 50 like you would for corn, you subtract 32. Just a couple of examples. Typical October day, high temperature of 64, 46 at night. You divide that by 2, subtract off the 32, you're getting, and this is pretty typical for October, you get about 20 to 25 GDDs that you're accumulating. Now, we move into winter. High of 36, low of 24, divided by 2, you have 30, you subtract off 32, and you get 0. Now, my math is wrong, I'm sure many of you are thinking, and it's not wrong from the perspective of wheat growing. Wheat does not grow below 32 degrees. However, it doesn't grow backwards below 32 degrees. So anytime you have 0 GDDs, or if you have a negative GDD accumulation, you make it 0. Now, emergence of that wheat from the time it's planted through imbibition, and you start seeing the first coleoptiles, takes about 235 GDDs. Typical October day, about 20 to 25, so you're looking at anywhere from about 9 to 10 days for emergence to occur. With each leaf that's added, it takes another 180 GDDs, and it takes 3 leaves before you'll have the formation of the first tiller, or approximately 775 GDDs are accumulated by the time you get that first tiller. With each additional leaf that's added, another 180 GDDs, you will get another tiller. Your goal is to establish about 3 tillers by the time we go into winter dormancy, or what we see in a lot of years, semi-dormancy. Now, more than 3 tillers may cause nitrogen stress by late winter. This is why you want to, for cover crop purposes, why you want to plant as early as you possibly can. Get as much growth as you can and consume that residual nitrogen. Tie it up. However, for producing a commodity, more than 3 tillers are not really going to contribute to yield. This is where that Hessian fly-free date becomes important. Using that date as the starting date for planting will allow you to optimize the amount of growth you want during the fall and winter to get those 3 tillers in most years. Now, the total number of GDDs to reach 3 tillers is approximately 1,200. This is what I define as green up. We grow winter wheat in this area. Because of that, we have a physiological process that needs to occur. It's called vernalization. And this process actually allows the plant to know that it will eventually go into reproductive growth. Fertilization for wheat will occur anytime the temperature is at or below 44 degrees Fahrenheit. Most of the soft wheat varieties we grow in this area will require most soft wheat varieties require between 15 and 60 days. Now, if you have a variety that comes out of the south, Georgia or Florida, it's probably 15 days simply because they don't have the cold temperatures in the winter, and it's just a simple matter of selection. If it's a variety from the northern tier states, you'll probably be closer to that 60-day range. Most of our varieties come out of Virginia, North Carolina, Maryland, require probably 30 to 50 days of fertilization. Once fertilization is complete, the spike primordia will form in the crown. This signals to the plant that the vegetative period of growth is nearing an end. And actually, with the accumulation of 1,350 GDDs, you will have accumulated enough for jointing to begin. And once jointing starts, you will have no more tillering. So let's just look at the accumulation of those GDDs. Central Maryland is the table I'm showing you here. Planting date of October 2nd, and we've got planting dates October 9, October 16. We're using 30-year average temperatures. Our emergence, you can see the average date of first tiller. We will have 3 tillers accumulate by the end of November, 1st of December, if we're right at the beginning of the planting window. If we move just 1 week later, you can see that we can delay getting to those 3 tillers until the end of January. Of course, we've got the jointing stage triggered by December 20th. However, we do need to go through this vernalization period, which really takes us until about January 10 if we plant it in the early part of this window. But any wheat that's planted during that early part of the planting window does not get any fall in, may be deficient of nitrogen by mid to late January if we have a period of warmer than usual January weather. And usually a period of a week or more would be necessary. Now, how did we fare this year? Same range of planting dates. I'm using temperatures from the winter of 2010-2011. We were doing pretty much normal through November. However, it got cold in early December. We didn't have 3 tillers until right at the end of the year for our early planting date, and it was mid-February for planting just 1 week later. We actually reached the joining stage of GDDs for the early date by February 17th. This was a year that if you planted during the early part of that window by mid-February with warmer temperatures, and we really didn't see them this year, you would have wanted to get your nitrogen out if you did have that extended period of warm weather. Now, lower shore, mid to lower shore, October 10 planting date we've got. December 6th, we would accumulate our 1,200 GDDs. The same thing with vernalization, with our jointing. In this case, if you plant in the early part of the window on the lower shore with average temperatures, again by mid to late January, you may be in a situation where you would want to get nitrogen out. For this winter, a little different situation. We kind of reached that green up stage with the early planting date around February 1st. As far as planting 10 days later, we were at the end of February, and we still hadn't accumulated our 1,200 GDDs. So we were in a situation where March 1 was a very good date for that first application of nitrogen. So as you can see, it does vary depending upon year and location as to when those first applications may be necessary. Let's just summarize what we've talked about this afternoon. Wheat responds to fall in a declining manner. In other words, yield drops as soil nitrate increases. With sites less than or equal to 10 parts per million in that surface half foot, you have an increased probability of a profitable response to fall in. However, that response will be variable. If you are going to use fall N, it looks like 30 pounds of N per acre is the rate to use. More than that doesn't benefit you. A little less than that, we didn't get the as good a performance as we did at 30 pounds of N when fall nitrogen was needed. If the nitrate N is greater than 10 parts per million, choose the commodity cover crop program. If it's less than 10 parts per million, use fall nitrogen. And of course, the quick fall nitrate test can identify these sites. Behind soybeans, no fall N appears to be necessary. You have a wonderful seed bed to plant into. You have, and it didn't matter what the maturity was, it seemed like there was enough residual N there to carry you through. And again, that timing in the spring would be the important thing you would want to pay attention to if you're behind soybeans. And as far as spring N timing, there is justification for using a growing degree day accumulation, 1,200 GDDs, to identify when green up occurs, and there's that justification for putting out spring N before March 1. I have been in conversation with MDA about this. They are listening, and I think we probably will be developing a system using